Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. My name's Jeremy Champa. Today we're going to talk about the second passage from October 2020 of the reading section of the SAT. So questions 11 through 20. I'm going to start with a skim. I think it's beneficial to do this part with me. Notice what parts I read and which parts I skip. Not every line's important. Let's jump right in and see if we can get the gist of the passage without worrying about every single detail. So let's read the introduction. This passage is adapted from a speech delivered in 1860 by John Hossack. Speech of John Hossack. Great name. Great title. Convicted of a violation of the fugitive slave law before Judge Drummond of the United States District Court, Chicago, Illinois. Hossack was tried for aiding an escaped African-American slave in violation of the fugitive slave law of 1850. Okay, jumping in. I am a foreigner. I was born among the rugged but free hills of Scotland, a land, sir, that never was conquered, and where a slave never breathed. Let a slave set foot on the shore, and his chains fall off forever, and he becomes what God made him, a man. I'm going to go down to the end of the paragraph because I get the gist. No living man, sir, has greater interest in its welfare, and it is because I am opposed to carrying out wicked and ungodly laws and love the freedom of my country that I stand before you today. So, there's definitely some questions I have. I don't know what it is that this person loves, if it's America or Scotland or freedom or what, but I get the gist of what he's talking about. He loves freedom and he's opposed to bad laws. Okay, next paragraph. Sir, I ought not to be sentenced because, as been argued by the prosecution, I am an abolitionist. I have no apologies to make for being an abolitionist. When I came to this country, so he's an abolitionist. I know there's a ton of stuff that I'm going to miss here, but I'm going to go to the end of the paragraph. Tell me, sir, with these views, can I be anything but an abolitionist? Surely, for this, I ought not to be sentenced. So, essentially, he's saying he has a set of beliefs, and those beliefs mean that he shouldn't be sentenced. Sorry, sometimes you have a hard time seeing that because of where I know my face appears on the screen, but these were the lines I was just reading. Next paragraph starts here. And, I'll read at least this much. Again, sir, I ought not to be sentenced because the fugitive slave law, under which I am torn from my family and business by the supple tools of the slave power, is at variance with both the spirit and the letter of Constitution. So now, at least he's saying his argument is that the fugitive slave law is against the more fundamental law of the Constitution. Massive paragraph. I know we're going to miss a ton, but I don't really care because my job is to just get a gist of the passage, and I definitely get the gist. End of the passage. Can it be, sir, that these great men, under cover of those hallowed words, intended to make a government that should outrage justice and trample upon liberty as no other government under the heavens has ever done? We get the idea. This is a person defending himself in a court of law and saying because he's an abolitionist, he shouldn't be tried for helping a person become or sort of run away from an unjust law, right? So let's jump into the questions. The most important thing, and I'll say this up front, the most important thing is the frame of the questions. That is, we have to figure out what kind of question we're working on so that we take the right approach. So, number 11 says the primary purpose of the passage is to convince the presiding judge that. Now, look, I will come back to this question if I were to be doing this in sort of the normal order. I'll do it now to avoid any confusion. But look, if you were doing this, and if I were doing this on a real test, and I didn't already, I've already read this passage before. If I hadn't, and I was doing this for the first time, I would certainly skip number 11. But I'll address it now just for the sake of keeping things in order. He says the fugitive slave law is sort of contrary to the Constitution. This answer choice sounds great for the first half. The second half is wrong. And I wouldn't expect you to know it with the skim we've done, but there's nowhere where he states that the local and state laws are the issue. He's saying it's in conflict with sort of moral law and the Constitution. And if we look at answer choice D, he's making this statement that he's an abolitionist. He did what he thought was right, and these shouldn't be considered crimes. Essentially he's saying, look, the Constitution is contrary to the fugitive slave law. So the law that you think I broke is not something that should be a law. Therefore, my behavior should not be a crime. That's why answer choice D is right. The other answers might make some logical sense because he does say he's foreign born, or at least, there's some substantive reason for B and C. He does say that he's done some good things for his country, so B and C make some sense, but the most compelling incorrect answer is A, and you can see that half of it's right and half of it's wrong. Okay, let's move on and tackle number 12. Hossick's descriptions of Scotland in lines 1 through 5 suggest that. Okay, so the frame of this question is specific lines. And it's not, sometimes if you have specific lines and ask about purpose or function, that is going to happen on number 13. We have a different strategy for something like that, but this question is just saying go to lines 1 through 5, and what is this suggesting? So I'll go back there, and what does he say? He says Scotland's a free country. It's never been conquered. There's never been slaves. And anyone who came there is sort of immediately free and becomes just a man or a woman, but not a slave. I don't know. I might have to do some contextual reading, but let's at least start there. I think, we should actually read a little bit further because I want some context here. He says, in this far-off land, so in America, I heard of your free institutions, your prairie lands, your protected canals, and your growing towns. 20 years ago. Okay, so look, if we look at these answer choices here, he's not saying that he was looking for greater freedom. It sounds like he was looking for a greater opportunity, right? The burgeoning towns, the new towns, and the canals suggest business and an ability to make money in commerce. B makes a lot of sense. Look, C is really close. I'm going to get rid of A because it sounded like Scotland was a free place. So he's not looking for greater freedom. He's not saying he lacked faith in the justice system, so it's definitely between B and C. And the best advice I can give you is to get rid of the answers that are the furthest away and sort of leave the two best answers for a second level of analysis. So I didn't see anything about fear of financial insecurity, especially in lines 1 through 5. Those lines just say, that it's a land of freedom. And certainly based on the rest of the passage, he has a love of freedom and the values of his homeland. He seems to really be prideful of the fact that Scotland is a land where there's no slaves, right? So it shaped his love of freedom. Now, C is close, but I don't see anything in the text that suggests financial insecurity. And look, I want to speak a little bit further about this because you would be right to say, well, if he came here for the financial opportunity, that might suggest that he's fearful that there's a lack of financial opportunity or that there is financial insecurity in his homeland. Yes, that's true. But the way that suggest works on this test is I would expect to see something like, I did not have security, right? Or, the security of America called to me, right? Or sort of like the promise of financial stability would probably be kind of the language I would be looking for. Something not exactly the word security, but something like that. I don't see anything like that. So that's why I'm going to go with B. So to sharpen up and finish this point, if you see the word suggest or indicate or infer or imply, that kind of language, yes, we can get a little bit off the page, but it's really still just like sort of the opposite. If it says something like, it's not raining, that would mean it's dry. Someone is not wealthy would imply that they're, maybe poor, right? I mean, I know that's not necessarily exactly right, but that's the way that the SAT works. Someone could be not wealthy and also not poor. But my point is that language of what I like to say is the language of negation is what you're looking for on suggest questions. So remember, I said at the beginning of this lesson, the frame of the question matters. What the word suggest means to me in the world and what the word suggest means to me on the SAT are slightly different things. On the SAT, in order for me to pick answer choice C, I would need something a little bit more direct about financial insecurity. I can't go stretching out for this answer and say, well, look, there's canals and he's looking for work. You would need to say something specifically about work. So I think it's important to elaborate on why I'm picking these answers and what I know about the test, because I can imagine a good student saying, what the heck, man, suggest makes sense with C. So I hope at least that shows you the rules that we're working with within this test. Know those rules, you'll get the right answer. Okay, so number 13 has a slightly different frame. The frame is the phrase primarily serves to. Every time you see primarily serves to, function, purpose, those kind of use, those phrases, function, purpose, use, serves, those words you should read right above and right below the set that they give you, or the words that they tell you to look for. So in this case, 8 to 15, the key information is not on 8 to 15, but actually, 8 to 15 would sort of help in this particular case, but the key information is right below. I mean, this bit right here, and even further, but really, it's usually just the first couple sentences. I mean, the lines 8 to 15 in this case will work really well because they'll essentially tell you he made Chicago what it is today. He's shipped some of the first grain that was exported from the city. A pioneer of Illinois. I've gone through many hardships to settle in this new country. That speaks to the answer here, but I just want you to know that generally speaking, when you see purpose or function, the last couple, the lines right before and right after are the important lines. And that still works here. I've spent upon it my best days, the strength of my manhood. Right? Really, that phrase alone suggests that he has given a lot to the city. Right? That's answer choice A. B is a classic example of an incorrect answer because he does talk about exports, but that's not the point of those lines, right? That's what those lines, that's part of what those lines say, but that's not the purpose of those lines. That's not what they serve to do. He talks about exporting the first grains from Chicago to say, look, I'm a part of this place and I've done a lot for this country. Now, it doesn't directly justify his attempts to undermine destructive government policies. That's close too, because you'd be like, well, look, since he is, this is really interesting, if you're interested in this kind of thing. What's interesting about this is that, in a sense, C is true. In a sense, he does justify, he's like, look, I've done a lot for this country. That justifies me breaking these bad laws, undermining these destructive government policies. But if that's true, the first part I said is I've done a lot for my country, therefore it justifies my behavior. I've done a lot for my country is the necessary first piece to say that that justifies his behavior. And if that's true, then we have to say that A is also true. If you were picking C, you would say these lines emphasize his contribution and therefore justify his attempts to undermine destructive government policies. He doesn't try to do so directly. And so that's why it's technically wrong. Essentially, he's saying, I'm a good member of this country. I'm a good citizen. And that doesn't justify his attempts to undermine destructive government policies. What justifies it is that they're bad laws. It's not that he's a hard worker or a part of the community. It's that the laws are bad. That's what justifies his behavior. So is it related? Yes. But this is a situation where sometimes what I'll say is answer choice C is a subset of answer choice A. That is, if you think answer choice C is true, you would have to admit that there's two correct answers, A and C. And we can't have that. So the answer that is contained within another answer, go with the bigger, broader answer. And, you know, this word obligated is wrong here for obvious reasons. I think maybe it's not obvious at first, but if we think carefully about it, the court's not obligated to do anything just because of, you know, the fact that he's worked hard, right? Okay, so a good question. We saw the purpose function piece. We saw the fact that a broad answer was better than a specific answer. So next we have Hosack indicates, so there's that word indicate, sort of like suggest or imply or infer, that upon coming to the United States, he identified with the Democratic Party because, okay, look, most important thing here is chronology. It should be after the last one, you know, which was dealing with 8 to 15, and before the next one, which is dealing with 34 to 35. So something about the Democratic Party in between those lines. I see the word Democrat capitalized right here. Right? In between the stuff we talked about. I don't see it before that, so that's a good place to jump in. So I'll just start at the well, no, let's start right a little bit closer to this word Democrat. When I came to this country, like the mass from beyond the sea, I think that means like sort of everyone from beyond the sea. I don't really know like the mass from beyond the sea, if that means like the masses. But either way, I was a Democrat. There was a charm in the name. Okay. But sir, I soon found that I had to go beyond the name of a party in this country in order to know anything of its principles or practice. I soon found that however much the great parties of my adopted country differed upon banks. Okay, so there was a charm in its name. So that's probably enough actually for the right answer here, which is it's superficial, for superficial reasons. There was a charm in its name. I liked the fact that democracy, right? You know, some of these other answer choices are close. And the first time I saw this question, I think I had read a bit too far and said something to myself like, okay, well, you know, maybe when he came to this country, he was already a Democrat and then he had to think harder about it. So that's kind of how I was thinking. Whoa, massive scroll. Sorry, my computer's kind of acting up with the scrolling. Let me get back to where we were. I think that you know, I was sort of convinced that he was already a Democrat when he came here, which sort of sounded like C. But then I thought to myself, okay, reminded him of multiple political parties in Scotland, not just he was a Democrat. So then I went back and didn't find that specifically and thought about the phrase, there's a charm in the name. There's a charm in the name. That really speaks to superficial reasons. He just liked the name. I know they talk about him coming from overseas, welcomed, you know, it says like the mass from across the sea. I think that's to suggest lots of immigrants were Democrats. But even if that's true, we need to find where it says it welcomed the newcomers. So let me see if there's anything speaking to that. When I came to this country, like the mass from beyond the sea, I was a Democrat. So in other words, many of them were Democrats. There's a charm in the name. So essentially, yeah, and then he says he's then, you know, to support why the right answer is for superficial reasons, he says, I had to go beyond the name of the party in this country. So this is the most important thing about this answer. Imply, infer, suggest, indicate. There's going to be something about sort of the language of negation, right? So not raining means it's, you know, a dry day or something. To say, I soon found that I had to go beyond the name of the party of this country. I'm sorry, let me read that again. I soon found that I had to go beyond the name of a party in this country in order to know anything of its principles or practice. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that at first he didn't go beyond the name. He did not, he started out or I'm sorry, if he had to go deeper, that would mean that originally he was not very deep, aka superficial. That's that language of negation. If you had to go deeper, it means you were not deep, aka superficial. That's how indicate questions work. Okay, let's keep going. We have another one of these serves mainly to questions. That's a lot like function, purpose, use. So 34, 35, I'm going to go a little bit above and a little bit below and look for the key information. We're talking about how this phrase swayed an iron rod over serves. Oh, like what's the purpose of that phrase? Okay, so here's the phrase right here. A little bit above. In one thing they agreed, and if you went a little bit above, it's like both of the political parties. I'll even go a little bit above. I soon found that however much the great parties of my adopted country, that is the US, differed upon banks, tariffs, and land questions, in one thing they agreed. So both parties are the same in one way. In trying which could stoop the lowest, which could go the lowest, to gain the favor of the most cursed system of slavery that ever swayed an iron rod over any nation. As a man who fled from the crushing aristocracy of my native land, how could I support a worse aristocracy in this land? So what does swayed an iron rod over mean? Sort of like the cursed system of slavery right before has power. That's what's being said there. The cursed system of slavery is the key here. Look, answer choice A, like so many other answer choices in the SAT, starts great, but is technically wrong because the end is wrong. There's not a single individual here. This is correct. The political influence by the slave owners. Control of weaker nations. No, we're not talking about different nations. That's why C is that we're talking about like both political parties are sort of subservient to slavery. And it's not about the political ideals. It's not like the Democrats or the Republicans are like, well, we're against slavery, but there's a discrepancy between my ideals against slavery and the process of governing. That's not what he's saying. He's saying swayed an iron rod over is like sort of controlled, right? So both parties were controlled by slavery. So answer choice B. Notice how A is so close until the end. So, now number 16. This is a great example of chronology. So it's before line 58, most likely, and it's after lines 34 and 35. And we're asking, again, about inference. Infer, imply, suggest, indicate those words. That Hossack became an abolitionist because. Now, look, there's all sorts of like good reasons maybe throughout the passage to pull on. But if we go in between 34 and the 50 is there, I think like right after where we finished reading, it said like, why is he an abolitionist? He says, as a man who fled the crushing aristocracy of my native land, how could I support a worse aristocracy in this land? That is, he left Scotland. It seems like he left partially because of a crushing aristocracy. And then he says, how could I support a worse aristocracy? In this case, he means like the aristocracy of, white supremacy is what he's talking about. The worst aristocracy of like, there being a ruling class lording over slaves, right? So why was he an abolitionist? Because of the fact that, he couldn't possibly, his love of freedom and his opposition to aristocracy meant that he couldn't be in favor of slavery. It's not that he had been part of some successful movement. In fact, there's never any slaves there, according to him. So that's why there's no abolitionist movement. It's not, this answer makes a lot of sense. It's like, oh, I was a Democrat, but then I realized that there was something wrong with that. But that's not what the passage says. The passage says he has to go deeper than Democrat and Republican. Look at the way this mapping works. So I'm always talking about how to map answers on. An unjust social system is aristocracy. Slavery was another aristocracy. He already opposed a crushing aristocracy. So an unjust social system, that is the word aristocracy here. Some of these other ones make some sense. But look, it's not that becoming a Democrat made him think more about slavery. It's that he realized that there was, and especially participation in the Democratic Party. It doesn't say necessarily that he participated in the party, just that he realized over time that being a member of a party, it wasn't just the word. It was like these other things, right? And it wasn't just the Democrats that were bad. He's saying that they both are bad in this way. So an unjust social system is aristocracy. That's the most important part of this question, is the mapping. So, I mean, maybe we should think about infer with the language of negation here. Let's see if we can do anything with that before we move on. So, I feel like the infer here is just the mapping of worse aristocracy. I don't know about the language of like not one thing. So here infer meant that slavery was aristocracy. Okay, what does profess mean? Now we have a words in context question. Whenever we do these, you're going to put your own word in on line 58 after you've read with context to sort of figure out what you would put in the place of profess, and then compare the answers. And the last step is always use the answer choices and see if you can figure out which one just sounds perfect in context. And don't just go with the one that you think sounds right without any context. Sometimes people are like, I know what profess means, I'll just pick an answer. Don't do that. It's always about the context. So on line 58, let's see. I'll read a little bit above. Sir, I place myself upon the Constitution in the presence of a nation who have the Declaration of Independence read to them every 4th of July and sort of say that they believe it. Say that they believe it. Let's see if there's a word that matches my attempt here. It's not confess that they believe the Constitution. They're not like, okay, I give up. I agree. It's not decline or instruct. It's definitely claim. They claim that they believe it. So words in context can be kind of tricky to get better at, but you got to trust the process. Read above and below, then put your own word in, cross off answers that are really far off, and then try out the remaining ones and see which one sounds right. In this case, claim is pretty perfect. Okay, 18. Which choice most clearly suggests that in Hossack's view, those who willfully distort the core principles of the United States should be considered criminals? Okay, those who distort the core principles of the Constitution should be considered criminals. Chronologically, you would assume that it's probably after 58, so it's probably one of these last three. That's not for sure. Sometimes the words in context are like kind of the least reliable boundaries for chronology. So it could be 55 to 58, but I'm going to start at 58 to 62. Criminals are the people who go against the Constitution. Let's see, 58 to 62. Yes, in the presence of civilized man, I hold the Constitution of my adopted country as clear from the blood of men and from the tyranny that would make crowned heads blush. I'm looking for something about criminals. Look, traitors to the Constitution. It's got to be this. The parties who bend the Constitution to the support of slavery are traitors. Traitors not only to liberties of millions of enslaved countrymen, but traitors to the Constitution itself. So it's got to be those lines, somewhere from like 62 to 66, somewhere in there. Let's see if there's a set that matches that. I mean, traitors is criminals. Yeah, it's exactly that. 62 to 66. Okay. So that was based on the mapping principle. Traitors was criminals, and they definitely talked just about the core principles of the Constitution, or of the United States. That is the Constitution. So you can map core principles as the Constitution and traitors as criminals. Willfully distort was also mappable. Let's see. That was where it said who bend, the parties who bend the Constitution to support slavery. That's willfully distort, right? Are traitors, criminals to the core principles, the Constitution. Cool. Okay, so mapping is a huge deal on the evidence questions. Let's see, number 19. It can be reasonably inferred from the passage that Hossack regards the authors of the founding documents of the United States to be. Okay, this is an evidence set. So with evidence sets, you always start with the question, then you go to the evidence, then you go back to the answer. So that is 19's question, 20's evidence, 19's answers. That's the way we do these. And that's because there's no reason you should ever pick an answer before you know what the evidence is, because it may be that your answer is logical or even supported by the text, but there's no evidence, there's no lines that work perfectly as evidence, right? So it may be something that you don't expect, so don't make up your mind about 19's answers. Okay, so let's kind of put this in our own words. What does he think about the founding fathers, the authors of the founding documents in the United States? So how does he think about the founding fathers? And it's probably after 66, since that was but that doesn't matter. All these are after 66. So which lines talk about in some way the founding fathers or the people who wrote the founding documents? Something about the documents or the founding fathers and what he thinks about them. 66 to 68, 69 to 75, 75 to 80. These are all kind of right in a row. So 66 to 84, something in there. That can save me some time just being like, okay, somewhere in that range, let's just go looking for, words about the founding documents or the founding fathers and all that stuff. Okay. So really everything after where I highlighted. So this whole area. A foreigner upon your soil, I go not to the platforms of contending parties to find truth. I, sir, go to the Constitution of my country. The word slave is not found. I read. So we're now talking about the document. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice. Yes, sir, establish justice. To promote the general welfare and security, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, so ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. Okay, so all those lines are relevant, and I might consider them, except the next line say, these were the men. So it should be, these lines are at least really appealing to me now. These were the men, that's the people who wrote the document, who had proclaimed to the world all men were created equal, that they were endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and contended even unto death for 7 long years. So I think he's referring to the Revolutionary War, fought for 7 years for this. Can it be, sir, that these great men under the hallowed... So we're still talking... I would stop there, except the next lines, which, are the last set of evidence, also talk about these men. Can it be, sir, that these great men, under cover of those hallowed words, intended to make a government that should outrage justice and trample upon liberty as no other government under the whole heavens has ever done? That's a rhetorical question at the end. Can it be true that these men were going to, were devious in making a document that would outrage justice in this terrible way? These people who fought for these ideas for 7 long years? The answer rhetorically would be no, although, in today's society, it's quite fashionable to question these people as, sort of being devious, conspiratorial, greedy lords who wanted to just have some excuse to not pay their taxes. You should go read, if you think that that's true, you should probably go read the first draft of the Declaration of Independence in Thomas Jefferson's own words. If you do, I think you'll see that he definitely understood that there was this problem with the hypocrisy of slavery, and he definitely thought it was bad. And, there's arguments to be had about that. But at least in this passage, he's the answer to this rhetorical question, are these bad dudes who are just saying some stuff, is no. So look, both of those evidence lines are good. So I think it's either, for evidence, it's one of the last two. And let's see what answer choices make sense, because those are the ones that talk directly about the men who wrote the paper. Well-meaning men who offered proposals that they feared would be difficult to implement. There is nothing about fear that it would be difficult to implement. They were brave enough to fight for 7 years, he's saying. Ambitious men who hoped to change the world with far-reaching pronouncements. Yeah, that sounds pretty good. Virtuous men who intended to reflect the actual practice of important ideals. I think that's also pretty good. Calculating men who made promises that would benefit them politically. That's sort of misreading the last lines. So D, we've kind of already addressed this. Even if you think that that's true, And sure, like, hey, it's a free country. You can think whatever you want. But even if you think that's true, that's not what Hossack is saying, because he's arguing in front of a judge. He wants the judge to say, yeah, you're right. Those men are good people. They weren't just deviously saying these things. So D is out because it mismatches. It doesn't match the question, which says, what does Hossack believe? Even if you think that that's not what Hossack thinks. So that's a classic answer because it messes with our expectations. Some people are just going to say, well, I believe that that's true, and they're going to pick it. But the question is carefully worded. It's not what is true about the Founding Fathers. It's what does Hossack regard to be true about the Founding Fathers? Right, so that one's out. I have 2 answers that are reasonable then for 19, B and C, and 2 evidence sets to go with them, C and D. Now, I don't know which one is right yet. The thing to do next is to compare the remaining 2 answers. So to say to yourself, what is the difference between B and C? All right, ambitious men or virtuous men, there's a difference there. Ambitious means you want to get stuff done. Virtuous means good people. Who hope to change the world with their far-reaching pronouncements. Okay, so they're changing the world, or they're intending to reflect actual practices of important ideals. Well, think about it in the context of this passage. Both of those could be true, but we're talking about the actual practice of the rules of the Constitution, right? He's saying something like slavery goes against the Constitution and the ideals of this country. So C sounds a little bit better off the bat, but go and do the mapping game. So ambitious men change the world. So I think that was closer to the first set of evidence. Let's see. They proclaimed to the world. Okay, now that's setting a red flag for me. It doesn't say they're trying to change the world necessarily. It says they're going to proclaim to the world that all men are created equal. Now, that's close to say change the world. So you can be like, oh, okay, well, what the heck's the difference there? And certainly there's this, that would be ambitious. But in terms of mapping, I don't see, I mean, I guess maybe contended to the death for 7 long years is like brave. I don't know if that's necessarily ambitious. It's pretty close. But the last piece, I mean, first of all, using the exact words from the evidence in an answer choice is usually a bad sign. The word world here was reused. That doesn't mean it's wrong, but there's sort of 3 things working against it here. I don't have anything I can directly map onto ambitious. There's also the use of exact language here. Change the world with far-reaching proclamation. Is that what it said? I think there's something else I don't like here, this far-reaching pronouncement. I mean, it is far-reaching to say all men are created equal. Sure, okay, far-reaching. The other problem is like the word inferred in the question. Think about how that last bit of hypothetical information worked. That's why I think the right answer is going to be C here and D here. These last lines, think about what you can infer or imply. The language of negation again. I mean, it doesn't directly say. Essentially, these lines say, could it possibly be true that these great men, so that means virtuous, that's mapping onto virtuous, under the cover of these hallowed words, intended to make a government that was unjust? The answer implicit to that, like we said, is no. So it implies that he thinks that they were virtuous men, great men, that maps on, who intended to actually make a government that would essentially, think of what this implies, not outrage justice, but uphold justice, and sort of not trample liberty, but sort of hold liberty on high. So the infer, imply, suggest piece here makes me think even more that the answer is C. Virtuous was easy to map. Reflect actual practice of important ideals. It fits the whole passage, and also this idea of infer with the hypothetical question for which, not hypothetical, the rhetorical question for which the answer is no. Okay, that's a really hard question. That's the hardest one here. So the problem, let me just go back to B a little bit. This idea of change the world with their far-reaching pronouncements, I think ambitious was kind of wrong, and I think it doesn't necessarily say that they were trying to change the world. It just says that they believed something was true, that men were created equal. I'll go back to the text because it's always important to point to the text. These were the lines we were considering that we think are wrong. Who proclaimed to the world that all men were created equal. So they're not, implied in that is that they're trying to change the world, but it's not as direct as, remember, imply, infer is about this language of negation. So this would imply that the whole world should change and that everyone should be treated equally, but it's not direct. They're not saying they wanted to have an effect on other countries and other governments, just in their own country, in their own government. So I think that's what's wrong with the idea of change the world. They use the word world, they proclaim to the world that something is true, but they don't necessarily say, there's nothing in here that directly says we're changing the rest of the world. Sure, in the grand scheme of things, just like we talked about back on, I'll tie this back into number 12. Number 12, we said that this answer could be implied or inferred from what's said right below lines 1 through 5. But ultimately, on the SAT, I know what to do with the word suggest. And the same, that is to say, I can't go stretching out to sort of all the different things it could imply. It's what does it directly say sort of by language of negation, right? So the value, he came from a place that was free, and that shaped his love of freedom, right? So in this case, I think the same thing applies. So I know that was hard, but I hope you can learn something from that. Biggest thing you can take away from these sessions is what are the sort of rules that I should follow when I'm in between two answer choices on the SAT? What is the frame of the question that tells me something? In this case, the frame was the word inferred, right? And the fact that it was an evidence set also is a frame, you could say. It's like an approach to the question is dictated by what sort of structure the question has. In this case, inferred. And the fact that it's an evidence set, we played that mapping game, right? So I hope that was helpful. Feel free to ask me any questions you want. I know that's not easy. To get a perfect score on the reading section is going to require a lot of careful deliberation. You can't just go with your gut. You've got to rely on what you know about the test. And the only way you learn about the test is by carefully examining questions, right? So my advice for you is go talk with your friends about questions like this. Work with other people who you think are motivated to do well in the test, and bounce ideas off each other. Watch the videos maybe separately or together, and then talk about the ways in which you could try this out on another question. See how this applies on another question. If you can kind of go look at a bunch of questions that say inferred and notice the game, I think you'll see what I'm talking about a little bit more clearly. Of course, feel free to reach out to me, send me an email, or give me a call, or comment on the videos, talk smack, do whatever you want. Have a good time. Happy studying. Take care.